It sounds like the Utah Jazz are open to trading away Lauri Markkanen. What are the odds the Pelicans can get him in exchange for Brandon Ingram? And the bigger question is, does he even fit? I'll explain why it's a gamble that's maybe worth taking in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Tuesday, we're going to look at a big name trade target that previously didn't think was going to get moved, but now it sounds like, from things going on around the NBA, Lauri Markkanen might be on the move, and maybe, I'm not entirely sold on this yet. We're going to see if I can convince myself the Pelicans should go after him right now as a trade target for Brandon Ingram. So we'll break it all down in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. This episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to do, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. So the dream trade target for a number of people, I think, is Lauri Markkanen. This dude is good and fits next to Zion Williamson in one capacity. There's a caveat to that, an asterisk to that, if you will. But Lauri Markkanen is a tremendous player, and him on the court next to Zion Williamson would be great. But there are two problems trying to bring him here to the Pelicans, to New Orleans. Let's start with this one. The first is he's not a center. He's not a center. This is someone who's a small forward, who's a power forward, but not a center. Hold on, more about that in a second here. So the big glaring need right now for New Orleans is not wing depth. Losing Najee Marshall hurts, but I think they're going to look at giving a lot of those minutes to Jordan Hawkins, to Matt Ryan, or to someone else next season. Antonio Reeves. You can fill it with a little bit of an undersized player. You have Trey Murphy there. You have Herb Jones there too. Power forward is occupied by Zion Williamson. Kind of as simple as that. You'll see Herb there. You'll see Trey there too. So that's not exactly what Lauri plays, is a position of need for New Orleans. So if the big need, the hole they need to plug on the roster right now is the big man spot, the center spot, and it really is with just Yves Missi, a rookie who's not ready for that kind of role yet, that's not ideal. That's a bit of a weird spot to put in, that if New Orleans trades Brandon Ingram and gives up picks, and you would need to give up picks to get Lauri Markkanen, all of a sudden that presents a problem because you still have that glaring hole at the center position, and you don't have really answers to that because, look, the free agent market on the center spot is drying up, and I'm not really worried about that. More on that in the third segment of today's show. So that presents kind of the problem, but there is some potential there for him to play center, or say you're just like, screw it, let's make it work. Him and Zion in the front court. There is some data and things to look at that go, maybe this can work. And the first is, there are 76 possessions this year. 76, that's it. 76 possessions this year where Lauri Markkanen plays center. That is the smallest sample size. Let's not read too much into this, but those 76 possessions were good. The Utah Jazz had a net rating of positive 34.2 when he played center. Now, that doesn't take into their opponent, the game, the situation, any of those factors. It's just the raw data. So you're missing literally all of the context around it. But that actually at least looked okay. But here's another thing that makes you wonder if it could work. Think about who he's played alongside. Walker Kessler has been their center there. He took a step back. We talked about him in yesterday's show. I'm not the biggest Walker Kessler fan, but you could do worse than him. But you have also seen John Collins play center alongside Lauri Markkanen at the power forward spot. John Collins is an undersized 5. He's 6'9". doesn't play like a true shot blocking, rim protecting center. Well, what if Lauri Markkanen and John Collins worked? That's similar, even if you would kind of be reversing the positions for Zion Williamson and Lauri Markkanen. And Markkanen has the height and makes you think he could play center. He's a 7-footer, but he definitely doesn't. By the way, Markkanen's stats 2 years ago, he won Most Improved Player, was an All-Star, 25.6 points per game, 8.6 rebounds, 2 assists, half a block, half a steal, shoots threes, over 7, almost 8 attempts per game 2 years ago, 39%. Last year, 23.2 points per game, 8.2 rebounds, 2 assists, half a block, almost 1 steal per game, shot 40% on 8 attempts per game. It's the 3-point shooting big man, right? New Orleans has never really put that court spacer next to Zion Williamson, and I think that's something we would all really, truly like to see. So this is maybe your opportunity to do it because not that many type of players like that exist. Now, some of those, again, he's not a center, but the numbers next to John Collins weren't bad. They weren't great, but Utah also wasn't a good team this past year. In 1,600 possessions, they had a net rating of minus 1.4. So it's a negative net rating, but they were a good rebounding team overall, with Lauri Markkanen and John Collins out there on the court together, defensive rebounding team. That says something, right? Like they made rebounding work. They weren't elite. They weren't bad. They were like slightly above average. Maybe that means you could make it work here, where you do play Lauri Markkanen more at center or Zion at the 5, knowing that you have a big-bodied man like John Collins next to him in the front court, and it's not an undersized player. Think of a lineup of DeJounte Murray, CJ McCollum, like Trey Murphy, Lauri Markkanen, and Zion Williamson. Like that's a pretty fun lineup. You could put Herb Jones in there. You could take CJ out for Herb, though I think you need CJ shooting. You're never going to play 5 out with Zion Williamson, but DeJounte can shoot, CJ can shoot, Trey can shoot, Lauri can shoot. It's 4 of your 5 guys right there. So it's not 5 out basketball, but it's 4. Playing 4 out around Zion. There's something to be said. The Utah Jazz made it work. The lineups with Markkanen and John Collins, I think, are what we would want to look at with that. There's a possibility that you could get this done, or that you could just do it and go, we'll figure it out later. This team would be a little bit light on some depth. They wouldn't have, and they still don't have a ton of money to spend in free agency, and guys are getting snapped up, and it wasn't a great free agent class anyway. But what if it's a 3-team deal? What if there's a way to truly make this work with a ton of picks and the right kind of players going to the Utah Jazz? Because I don't think they want Brandon Ingram. If you're trading Lauri Markkanen, you're trying to bottom out and be bad. You don't need Brandon Ingram making you better. So what about a 3-team trade? I've got one for you that I want to hear what you think. I don't know. Tell me what you think coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I love sports, and I love them so much I never want them to stop. But as the NBA playoffs are now over, and we're getting fewer games, and the sports they're not out there as much as we want them to, FanDuel is going to let you keep the sports going whenever you want, and all you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that you're in the mood. There's still Major League Baseball going on right now. The Olympics are coming up. You also have tons of soccer on TV always. So this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sportsbook of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. No one's coming to y'all like this, breaking down the collective bargaining agreement, explaining why the Pelicans are where they are and what it means for their future moves. I told you don't worry about the first apron. There was no need to after what David Griffin said. Some people panicked we did not hear at Locked On Pelicans. So please subscribe, tell a friend about the show, and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans, wherever you get your podcasts. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, so let's look at this trade. Lauri Markkanen. It's not an easy player to acquire. One of the things to keep in mind is Danny Ainge runs the Utah Jazz, and that dude does not like to lose trades, so you are going to need to send him things. If there is any sort of trade where like the national media would be like, oh, Danny Ainge lost that trade's not going to happen. It makes him a pain to deal with. But I've got a 3-team deal that maybe makes everybody happy here. And that's a 3-team deal with the Sacramento Kings. And we talked about them yesterday with Brandon Ingram. So here's the trade. Let me pull this up. The New Orleans Pelicans, we'll get to them in a minute. The Sacramento Kings get Brandon Ingram. Just get Brandon Ingram. The Utah Jazz get Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter. And the New Orleans Pelicans get Lauri Markkanen and John Collins. The Utah Jazz also get 2 picks from the Sacramento Kings. Someone pointed out in the comments that because of the picks they owe, they can only trade 2 right now. So like, that was great. Thank you for that. 2 picks. And then maybe the Pelicans need to send 3 picks to the Utah Jazz. So the Utah Jazz get 5 first-round picks, Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter. Brandon Ingram goes to the Sacramento Kings, and the Pelicans get both John Collins and Lauri Markkanen. This solves 2 things. One, it just puts Lauri Markkanen on this team. You can figure out the positional stuff later. You also get John Collins to give you that kind of small ball switchy 5 that you lost in the Larry Nance Jr. trade. Utah also sheds about $10 million in payroll this season. You know, you could very easily trade at least Kevin Huerter and definitely, I think, also Harrison Barnes later. So they have a chance to get even more picks from this trade. And again, they don't particularly want Brandon Ingram if they're trying to bottom out, acquire picks, and find their next generational superstar. Plus, you have Lauri Markkanen, who's going to be due for a massive contract soon, and maybe that's not the direction that they want to go because that's going to make you more competitive. So 5 picks, Harrison Barnes, Kevin Huerter going to the Utah Jazz. Brandon Ingram to the Kings, and John Collins and Lauri Markkanen to New Orleans. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if that's enough for Lauri Markkanen, let alone John Collins, though I don't think Collins is a particularly good asset to trade or anything like that. That's the one I came up with. What do you think? Would it work? Would it not work? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. I'm kind of curious. The mic wants to just not be on the camera here and everything. We'll have this set up a little bit better in the next couple of days too. So I don't know. Let me know what you think. I would do that. If you could get Collins and Markkanen for Brandon Ingram and 3 first-round picks, I would do that trade in a moment. Markkanen makes that much sense around Zion Williamson. You know, Collins gives you depth that you are severely lacking in the front court right now. And that's better than anyone on free agency, even if I'm not the biggest Collins fan. I used to be, not anymore. So I think that's maybe the way to go with some of this. I'm curious, again, what you think. So let's switch gears here, because what I like about that version of this trade is that the Pelicans are going for it, right? And I think there's something to be said for going for it if you're New Orleans right now, because the West seems very wide open in a way that it hasn't in a while. When you look at some of these teams in the Western Conference, I think 2 teams got better. The Oklahoma City Thunder got much better. I think the Dallas Mavericks got better too. And I also think the Pelicans got better with DeJounte Murray on this team. But teams like Denver got worse. Minnesota stayed the same, and there were some big question marks around them. Memphis should be better than they were last year, but did they improve in kind of what's an arms race in the Western Conference? I think the answer is no. Golden State got worse. The Clippers got worse, losing Paul George. The Lakers have missed out on any name that they were linked to, so that's not a good position to be in. They were a play-in tournament team last year, and they haven't particularly improved, even if I really do like Dalton Connect for them. Phoenix is staying the same. Sacramento has stayed the same. Here in this trade scenario, they'd get better, but New Orleans gets much better than them getting Lauri Markkanen on the team. The Spurs are better, but they're not going to be that competitive. Houston is just Houston. They're around where they were last year, wanting to be competitive. Maybe they need to make a bigger move. We'll see with all of that. But overall, New Orleans is going for it at the right time. And that's what I like about them being so aggressive this offseason. There is no real established like hierarchy in the West, maybe outside of OKC and Dallas right now. And it took Dallas having kind of a miracle second half to propel them, where you look at a guy like Daniel Gafford now, he was not playing well in the playoffs. Can they rely on him again? Can they rely on that kind of luck again? And I'm not sure. Minnesota, again, great regular season team, did not get it done in the playoffs. Phoenix getting swept in the first round. This is wide open. So New Orleans going for it, even if the roster fit is clunky with Lauri Markkanen, CJ McCollum, Zion Williamson, and some of the others, in not having like a true outstanding center on the roster, I think it's okay because you might be able to get by with it. There's other players that you can get later down the line that I think would really fit. And, New Orleans could be in a position where maybe they go after the guy on the buyout market or something like that, depending on what they have, left of the mid-level exception when all the dust settles on the Murray trade and whatever the Brandon Ingram trade is going to be. So they've kind of like pushed their chips in at the right time. A lot of times it's about just timing when your window is. Think about Houston with James Harden and what their timing was, right? They just went up against Golden State every year and they couldn't get over that hump because Golden State was so good. And it's a shame because that's a team that could have won a title. That Houston team with, Chris Paul with Harden on there, like could have won a title if it wasn't for Golden State in the way. Right now, there's no team that you look at and you're like, man, they're going to be, OKC is going to be there, right? But again, they're unproven. They haven't won title after title like Golden State did, where you looked at Houston trying their best to their credit, but it was like they're never going to get over that hump. And New Orleans going right in right now, like diving into a competitive Western Conference where who knows how good some of these teams are going to be. I like that move. I like the timing on this when you look at some of the teams that have gotten worse. The Lakers are one injury away from having a disaster of a season. The Clippers losing Paul George and having no way to replace him. That's not a great situation for them. Golden State, it's like the end of an era losing Klay Thompson and then just waiving Chris Paul, right? They dumped Jordan Poole's contract essentially is what that became. He was the piece they got back. That's kind of wild to think about. So when you look at the Western Conference, New Orleans is, I think, in the upper echelon of it. Like they look like a home court advantage team right now. When you look at some of the teams that have taken a step back, keep being aggressive. And David Griffin and Bryson Graham promised that they were going to do that. They did. They delivered. And I think there's still a lot more time for them to keep delivering on this because not including Brandon Ingram in a trade for DeJounte Murray was a great piece of work that opens up so many other possibilities. So go get a guy like Lauri Markkanen. Go and make those bigger moves. Because look, and we'll talk about them in the next segment, don't worry about any of these free agents that are signing elsewhere. Nice pieces, sure. But they're like role players, 8th, 9th, 10th men, I think, at best. So we'll talk about the market drying up and why I'm just not worried about that. Like not worried about that at all. So those are the type of things that those are the players I want to look at coming up here next let's do that right now. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you're listening to Locked On Pelicans Monday through Friday. If you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. So free agency, we're in day 2 of it. And, the majority of this happens right in the beginning. But that front court market, the big man market is really drying up when you look at, the free agents that have kind of signed and things like that. I'm also not overly worried about this, like at all, when you look at some of the names that have signed. Talking ourselves into Andre Drummond was a thing. And I do think he, of all the people, would be serviceable, but he signed. But if Andre Drummond was going to make or break the Pelican season, there's bigger issues here. Again, I talked about Goga Bitadze. He re-signed with the Orlando Magic. That's someone who averaged 5 points and 4.6 rebounds last season. Like, is that the end of the world that he's not signing here? Mo Bamba sounds great in theory, right? Totally, I agree. But No. Last season in limited games for the Philadelphia 76ers, 4 points, 4.2 rebounds. He shot 1 3 a game. A center who shoots 1 3 a game isn't a court spacer, doesn't have court gravity. There's no need to panic over these end of rotation guys signing with other teams. Would a little bit of depth be nice? Yeah. But that's why you trade Brandon Ingram either directly getting you the center or indirectly getting you the center, where he's the first move and you get back multiple contracts that you can then flip and turn into the player that you want. You wouldn't trade Brandon Ingram from Wendell Carter Jr. Would you trade Kevin Huerter and a first-round pick for Wendell Carter Jr.? Yeah, you would. And then you can still flip Harrison Barnes somewhere else to improve your roster. So that's how you could and should look at some of these trades. And one of the things that we know that I've talked about on the show here, and someone who's talked about this a lot is Shamit Dua, who knows the CBA better than I do, talked about how some things aren't quite adding up to make this trade legal with the Pelicans and the Atlanta Hawks. So this trade probably needs to grow a little bit more. And it doesn't need to grow by simply signing, trading Jonas Valanciunas or Najee Marshall. Because think about this, right? It's going to expand in other ways, I think. It could do that. But why would the Dallas Mavericks signing Najee Marshall to their mid-level exception make this a signing trade where they need to send something back to New Orleans? They're not going to try and help the Pelicans. That makes no sense. Even if they sent a fake second-round pick and you can put protections on a second-round pick where it basically won't convey to the person you're trading with, why would they make it easier for New Orleans to acquire DeJounte Murray? Why would they help them acquire DeJounte Murray even in a sign and trade, which doesn't do Dallas any good because they can just straight up outright sign Najee Marshall? Same thing for the Washington Wizards. They could help New Orleans in a sign and trade, but why would you? There's no reason for them to do that whatsoever. There's no incentive, especially when they would need to send something back. So this trade is likely going to expand and include a center or pieces that will get you that center. That's what the Brandon Ingram deal to me is for something in the future. Get a center, get a big man, and then you're going to be okay and good to go with it. I'm not stressed about losing out on Mo Bamba. If he was that good, he would be starting, he would be playing, right? He would be in a role that was better suited to that, and that's not the case. There's still guys that you could try and go and get, potentially. There's Mo Wagner, who I think, as a cheap potentially option could be a good guy. Precious Achiuwa from Toronto is a guy that you could get too. There's names out there. James Wiseman is one that a lot of people have mentioned. He's not good, but if you just need to sign a dude to a minimum deal, him, Bismack Biyombo, right, are all names that you could go and try and get. And I think that's a situation where you could end up being fine, right? You could bring back Cody Zeller if you needed to. We love the Cody Zeller minutes. A social media superstar here when it comes to that sort of thing for New Orleans. So missing out on some of these guys, I'm not stressed about it at all here. So I don't think there's a need to panic or anything like that when it comes to free agency. I think let's wait to see what ends up happening with the Brandon Ingram trade, because David Griffin has been very creative with those type of deals in the past. So yeah, the free agent market's drying up. Cool. That's none of those guys I want starting on this team. Backup, sure, but I don't want anyone that I mentioned playing 20 minutes per game probably. You could convince me with Drummond, but I wouldn't be thrilled with that. That was when I was saying, yeah, go cheap at the center position. But you don't need to do that now. There's no need to go only cheap at the center position. So I'm excited to see what the Brandon Ingram trade is going to be. And look, it's not that I want to trade him. I don't care if he comes back or doesn't. I want this team to just be the best version of themselves. And that's what I think the front office seems to think too. And if they feel they need a center to do that, Brandon Ingram is how you're going to acquire one. Because look, all the reporting and talking to people with the team basically says hey, CJ's not going anywhere. So I don't anticipate a CJ McCollum trade that brings in a center. And CJ McCollum also has more value here in New Orleans than he would to other teams. So that's something that's worth keeping in mind too when it comes to that. That Brandon Ingram is probably your most valuable thing, outside of Trey Murphy, Herb Jones, that you could trade right now. Well, then trade that valuable thing and get something good back. You don't need to go cheap at the center position. Dream bigger here when it comes to that. That's what I think is going to end up happening here in New Orleans when all of the dust settles. And it might not be this week, it might not be next week, it might drag into the summer, and I think that's going to end up being just fine because, as I've said, as long as you're set for training camp, and even then, these trades can take a little bit, and I think that's what you'll end up seeing with the Brandon Ingram trade that'll likely be a 3-team deal. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. I'm going to be back with y'all tomorrow. Eventually we'll get to Eve Misi a little bit more. I want to dispel something that makes me much more optimistic about him than I was before. That's something that I'm excited to talk about. That's coming up soon this week on Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.